Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Bolt Breakdowns here on the Guilty as Charged podcast YouTube channel. Soon on the podcast, we'll be going position group by position group and sort of doing a buy or sell on certain players on the team. Really, we're going to go through almost every player on the roster and sort of say whether we buy or sell their 2021 stock. So we are going to be doing that in some upcoming episodes. But I sort of want to go position by position too and talk more about the key questions that I think have to be answered in 2021 for the success or failure of each group and sort of the factors that I think they'll depend on ultimately. So today I'm going to be starting with the wide receivers. That's Keenan Allen, that's Mike Williams, the whole aliens gang, as they used to call themselves. And so let's get into that. Before we do, I do want to shout out Manscaped, of course. Use code GUILTY at checkout on your first purchase. You can get that new razor that they have, the 4.0. That'll help you with your gooch down there. But more importantly, let's get into the Chargers receivers. And I do sort of have a list of 4 questions that I think will determine the success, failure, and future of the group going forward. The number one question is, of course, what will Mike Williams do in a contract year? This is effectively a 1-year, $15 million deal for him. I know there are a lot of people upset that the Chargers picked that up, but they ultimately didn't have a viable way to replace him. Unless you wanted to go receiver in the first round, which I think would have been a bad idea. As good as Devonta Smith, as good as some of the other guys in the draft were, it just didn't make sense for the Chargers to take a first round receiver with the other needs that they had. So if the Chargers are going to replace Mike Williams in the future, I think it has to be down the road. And ultimately, I think Mike Williams is good enough to be included in this team anyway. Yes, there are drawbacks, but if you're not spending that $15 million on anything else, and I think it's pretty clear from their offseason that the Chargers still were able to do what they wanted to do, sign Corey Linsley and make the moves they did. There's Matt Filer, Sean Slater in the draft. They were still able to fix, to some extent, their cornerback room and their offensive line, without that $15 million that they're paying Mike Williams, right? It didn't inhibit them from doing anything they wanted to do. So I think that's a clear point to bring up. But going forward, are they going to be paying him $15 million every year for the next 3 or 4 years? That will depend on his production this year. And I think when you look at Mike Williams' production, the thing that really stands out to me is, of course, yards per reception still fairly high in that category, despite Justin Herbert's yards per attempt not being super high. Obviously, he reached a peak of 20.4 with Phillip Rivers in his last season, who sort of used Mike Williams to great effect, I think, in 2019, although, a lot of them were kind of deep balls, Hail Marys. But, he did good with them and led the Chargers back into some games. Of course, people remember the Chiefs-Mexico game. People remember the Saints game this year with Justin Herbert, where Mike Williams came down with a couple clutch grabs. Unfortunately, didn't get the one in overtime, but that is what it is. He is the premier, I think, deep ball receiver for the Chargers, as well as he can do some work in the intermediate ranges as well, particularly in the red zone, although unfortunately this year only had 5 touchdowns, but that was actually, I think, an improvement over his 2019 campaign where he had 2, but he still hasn't hit that 2018 when he did have 10 receiving touchdowns. So I think the thing with Mike Williams going forward is what percentage of the offense does he really take up? Joe Lombardi has talked about him as an X-receiver, comparing him to Michael Thomas. Hunter Henry has obviously exited the Chargers and is now in New England. So does Mike Williams get some of those targets? I think that'll be an interesting question. I don't see Jared Cook being a 700 or 800 yard receiver, so some of that production will have to come from Mike Williams and Austin Eckler and Keenan Allen, and picking up a little bit of that slack that maybe 13 million of Hunter Henry wasn't worth, right? So I think you will see these numbers go up. I certainly think you'll see more targets for Mike Williams. And I don't think, another year of working with Justin Herbert will ultimately help his game. I think going into last year, Mike Williams was sort of in this no man's land zone when it came to receivers because, Keenan Allen was Justin Herbert's primary target. And then Justin Herbert was, using a lot, used to working with a lot of the second string receivers, Jalen Guyton and Tyron Johnson. You saw that, really pick up last year. And so I think Mike Williams was sort of left in between where he didn't really cultivate this relationship with Justin Herbert, but I don't think that was necessarily his fault either. I just think it was a bit of a weird, situation, especially when Tyrod threw the ball to him quite a lot in that Cincinnati Bengals game. People remember, and he actually did pretty good in that one. Unfortunately, Tyrod also almost got him killed a couple times. But I do think that there is something to that quarterback change, mostly affected Mike Williams out of any other receiver. So I think another year working with Justin Herbert will sort of, will him to a better season. I don't know if he'll crack 1,000 yards again. That was sort of maybe a bit of an anomaly looking back on it, but I do think his numbers ultimately will increase. And if he can get that contract, that'll be great for him. I do think the Chargers want to re-sign him, but I don't think they will offer him an extension in the same way that they offered Keenan Allen and Joey Bosa before even seeing them play in 2020. I don't think it's that kind of situation, obviously, but to me, Mike Williams really has to develop just being a better route runner, and also when he is going up for the deep ball, the problem there is, the safety is going to really be a problem because they cannot afford to have him off the field. If you're paying him $15 million, you really need that production from him. And so missing halves, missing quarters of games because, say he falls on his shoulder, falls on his back, I think that's a practice that really needs to stop if the Chargers are going to sign him to a long-term deal. But as I said, we'll see with Mike Williams and whether he'll be a Charger going forward. He could obviously play his way out of their price range, but I sort of think the real answer will be somewhere in between balling out and, his season last year. I do sort of think he will agree to a contract extension, but probably realistically in next year's free agency. So going to our next question, we want to talk about Taron Johnson and Jalen Guyton, who sort of bursted into the scene out of nowhere last year. It wasn't exactly out of nowhere. Tyron Johnson obviously came off the practice squad, started week 4, had a big game there, had a couple other big weeks as well, and sort of, really put himself into that rotation, which was really impressive for a practice squad player. But Tyron Johnson, also not a scrub either, right? He, was a 5-star recruit coming into college and has a lot of athleticism. I think is one of the better route runners in terms of the receiver room. Jalen Guyton is obviously the other guy that we talk about where he, also exploded on the scene. I think he had about 500 or 600 yards last year, which is kind of crazy to think about. Yeah, 511, 18.3 yards per reception, 3 touchdowns. He sort of bursted onto the scene last year too. And this is going to be a question because both are restricted free agents after 2021. So, if they do ball out, the team can ultimately make an offer to them that the Chargers may not be able to match, but that depends on their season, right? As we say with Mike Williams too, although the prices for guys like Guyton and Johnson are a little bit different than they are for Williams, just based on name cachet and obviously, their ceiling and potential. And so with Jalen Guyton, I think it's really just about, can he be a more efficient receiver, right? We did see him drop 6 passes last year, which doesn't sound terrible on paper, but when you consider that he only had 28 receptions and he's not getting targeted that often, he did rank top 5 in drop percentage on PFF. That is concerning. And you do see moments where he is a bit like Travis Benjamin, where he sort of tries to catch the ball with his body instead of his hands. So that's something that I think he'll have to clean up going forward. Hopefully, the new coaching staff can kind of get the best of Jalen Guyton out of him, because I do truly believe if he can become a more efficient receiver, there is something special there just about his burst, his ability to burn guys down the field. The Chargers kind of thought they had that with Travis Benjamin for a while when they signed him, but then quickly realized, he was getting a little bit older and wasn't that great anymore. And he did make some costly errors and drops for the team. So really for Jalen Guyton, I think it's just about that. Tyron Johnson is the more interesting guy to me, just because I do believe he is more of an athlete. And, he did kind of come into his stint with the team later, wasn't a major factor in training camp, but then, has that Bucks game with his buddy Jalen Guyton. And so, for him, I think it's just becoming a more reliable player as well. And he sort of did show that towards the end of the season with some big performances, particularly the one against the Raiders was a big help to the team. So are they simply supplementary receivers, or can one or both of them grow into more than that? I think that's a big question in 2021. Let's go to this third question. So can Keenan Allen reverse his yards per reception trend? Now you might wonder, what am I talking about? So I was just kind of browsing the numbers, and when you look at Keenan Allen's yards per reception, you see he had 14.7 in his rookie year, where he obviously won Rookie of the Year and were tied with Eddie Lacy, depending on who you ask. But to me, Keenan Allen was the Rookie of the Year that year. Then sort of dipped down to 10.2, 10.8, of course, had the ACL injury, unfortunately, in 2016. But then you saw that come back to 13.7. But what you've actually seen the last few years, sort of coinciding with the decline of Phillip Rivers and the transition to Justin Herbert, is a bit of a dip. So you see 13.7 yards, 12.3 yards, 11.5 yards per reception, and 9.9 yards. Now, I don't think this is super concerning in terms of what the future is for Keenan Allen. A lot of people have pointed out this stat as something as a receiver who's approaching 30 years old, is about to be on the wrong side of that. But, the thing about that is, Justin Herbert did throw a lot of short passes last year. Justin Herbert had 7.3 yards per attempt, didn't really have the green light to, just chuck it deep until later in the season. And so that's something that's going to bring Keenan Allen and some of the other receivers' yards per reception down, just because, that's what it's going to be. He also, was such a first down converter on third downs in particular. So if he's trying to get to the marker, he might not run past it, right? It's just kind of about getting that first down, and then, a lot of the, hitters will come and get them. There weren't a lot of other Chargers guys to double cover last year, right? So in terms of yards per reception, that also is kind of another reason why it's low when he does get to the marker and get that first down. So I don't think this is something to worry about, but it's something to watch. I think, especially because Keenan Allen is entering the first year of his 4-year extension here, does he feel like this was just sort of a one-season thing, and that when Justin Herbert gets more comfortable, he'll ultimately be more comfortable and you'll see those yards per reception go up? I tend to think that's what's going to happen, but there are a lot of offensive questions in the wake of Hunter Henry's departure. Is Mike Williams still the deep ball guy, or does he kind of balance out with Keenan Allen in terms of being a better route runner? Let's see how that plays out. But that's just an interesting trend, I think, is watch. It's going to be interesting to watch as Keenan Allen heads into another year with the Chargers. This fourth question is kind of blunt, but do KJ Hill and or Joe Reed crack the roster? So Brandon Staley has not talked about Joe Reed very much. We sort of talked about that on the show. He also hasn't mentioned KJ Hill very much. And you are talking about guys that were day 3 picks a year ago under a different coaching administration. Joe Reed is sort of still struggling to line up in the right spots. Is he a wide receiver? Is he a running back? That's sort of the question. I do think they envision Joe Reed being that Swiss Army knife, but it's kind of clear he's not there yet. Will he be there by training camp? Who knows? As for KJ Hill, he did, have a little bit of a late season resurgence when guys like Keenan Allen and Mike Williams couldn't play. He did have a couple clutch catches against the Raiders, actually, in that game that helped the Chargers win. But, is that something to watch going forward? Is he simply going to be a slot receiver, or, can he develop into more potentially? I think the answer is probably that he's just going to be a slot receiver, but you never know. Obviously, when KJ Hill was drafted, he was deemed to be the steal of the draft. And I still think to some extent that is true based on where he probably should have gone. But, that's going to be interesting to watch with KJ Hill going forward. And there's just such a lot of competition on that in this position group in particular, right? You do have Keenan Allen, you do have Mike Williams, and Tyron Johnson, Jalen Guyton, and they just drafted Josh Palmer, right? I didn't put him into this questions group, but he does create questions for the guys they drafted last year. If you have 5 guys who are basically locks to make the roster, and the Chargers usually go with 5 or 6 receivers, then that puts really a lot of stress on KJ Hill or Joe Reed to even make the roster. So I think one of them will ultimately make it. Which one? That remains to be seen. I would probably lean towards KJ Hill at this point, but Joe Reed does have that special teams play when he's able to be that kind of player. So maybe he shows more of his Virginia form coming into training camp. But those are my 4 questions about the 2021 wide receiver group. Let me know what you think about these 4 questions in the comments down below. I'll be replying and, talking to you guys down there. But yeah, I will see you guys on the next Bolt Beat positional breakdown. See you guys then.